life of accomplishment, all for the glory of God. Welcome to this special Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup.
And good evening from Washington. I'm Jenna Browder. Billy Graham once said, "The greatest legacy one can pass on to one's children and grandchildren is not money or other material things accumulated in one's life, but rather a legacy of character and faith." Since the passing of CBN founder Pat Robertson, his family is remembering him for those very things.
CBN White House correspondent Abigail Robertson is Pat's granddaughter. A few years ago, she had the chance to sit down with him for a special interview to discuss his life and how he wants to be remembered. In tonight's Faith Nation, we'll bring you much of that interview.
From broadcasting to politics to starting a university and fighting for religious liberty, Pat Robertson's life was marked by many things. But his story truly starts with a radical encounter with Jesus.
Who was Pat Robertson before you met Jesus?
Well, I was going to be a young entrepreneur. I had a degree from Yale Law School. I really wasn't going to practice law, but I wanted to go into business, and I was set out not only as a pretty hard party creature, but I wanted to make a lot of money. I was very materialistic.
Mm-hmm. So what caused such a radical transformation and led you into ministry?
Well, it was a sort of a shock that went on in my life, but I had a radical transformation, and I just somehow, Augustine said, "Our hearts are restless till they rest in thee," and I wasn't satisfied. I had gone all over the world. I had gone to school at the University of London. I had traveled in Europe. I had done the party scene. I'd done everything you could do, but I wasn't happy, and I needed the Lord, and I decided that the time was come where really I ought to serve Him, and I try to make a bunch of money and build some big corporation that would make me rich.
Mm-hmm. You literally sold everything.
Yeah.
You left your old life completely behind. Did you ever have any doubts that you'd made the wrong decision?
Not then. I had, by that time, learned to trust the Lord, and I was filled with the Spirit, and I thought that the Lord would lead me, and I was being led by Him, and I wanted to follow His leading, and I believed in God. I believed in His power, and I had given myself to Him,
Mm-hmm.
and I knew that God would lead us, and God would lead me and speak to me, and I was counting on that as the source of my life's blessing.
One thing I was so impressed by is how you managed just to, as you were raising kids, you managed to keep your marriage intact. And how did you navigate that season when the Lord was speaking to you? You were making these radical changes, but Mamas wasn't necessarily understanding everything. And how did that season play out?
Well, there was one time that I had a group of people from seminary, where I was in seminary, and well, I could go back a little bit. The thing that was so significant, God was leading me out of the Bible. I would open the Bible, I would pray and say, "God, please speak to me out of your word," and I'd put my finger on a verse. And I opened the Bible. The verse I read was Luke 12:33, and it said, "Sell your possessions, give to the poor, and come follow me." So we were living in an apartment in Queens, in New York, in Woodside, and I called my wife, who happened to be out in Columbus, Ohio, at her folks' place, and I said, "Dear, God is speaking to me out of Luke 12:33, and she said, "Well, you do whatever the Lord shows you." I said, "Okay." So a few days later, I put an ad in the paper that we had some early American furniture for sale. My apartment was full of people. I sold everything, got the money, went to Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, gave the money to my friend Dick Simmons. I said, "You give this to the poor people in Bed-Stuy." And then I moved in, and the next thing you know, I got a call from your grandmother who said, "How come the calls are coming to Brooklyn?" And I said, "Well, I have sold our furniture and moved over here." She said, "You've done what?" And I said, "Well, I told you the Lord was speaking to me out of Luke 12:33, and you said to do it. And she said, I don't read that stuff. I said, well, you should now.
When the Lord started speaking to you and laying out a vision for CBN, what did that look like?
Well, it didn't look like a whole lot because I was, the only verse I had to go on at this particular time, I'd spent time praying, and the word came to me, go to your home and tell what great things the Lord has done for you. And I didn't know exactly what to do, but I figured I'd better go to my home in Virginia as opposed to staying in New York. And so I went, my home was in Lexington, Virginia, and I drove down to Lexington. My wife and children were at that time out at her father's place in Ohio, in Columbus. And I got there and learned that there was an invitation to preach at this little conservative Presbyterian church that was up the street from where we lived and where my mother attended church. And so I went there, and that evening, I guess it was that night, they let me speak to the congregation. And when it was over with, this man said, look, I'm one of the elders of the church. I'm a businessman. I'd like to sponsor you on the radio. Well, I'd never been on the radio in my life. So I went on a station called WREL. That's for Robert E. Lee, REL. It was Lexington's AM station. And they put me on the air for a whole week. I think, had 15 minutes a day, every day for all week. Well, on the way to the station one day, I stopped at the post office, and here at the post office was a man named George Lauderdale, who had been a classmate of mine at Lexington High School when years and years before. I hadn't seen him maybe 17 years. And I said, George, what are you doing? He said, well, I had a vision from a man of Rockbridge County who said, your work here is not done. You must come up to Lexington. And on the strength of that, George got in the car, drove all the way up to Lexington, and here he appeared just as I was at the post office. And he said, well, there's a TV station in Portsmouth. He said, you ought to claim it from the Lord. And I said, well, George, I don't know anything about television. I didn't even own a television set. And he said, well, it's easy. You just go do it. I said, well, okay. That's the way it is. So that's how I started.
Wow. And how did you acquire the TV station?
Well, I first of all found it was off the air. UHF, it was Channel 27, and it was owned by a man named Tim Bright. And Tim Bright was a used car dealer in town, and his thing was called Bright Motors. And he had made a real mess of the station, and they had taken it off the air when there was a combination where the FCC put Channel 13 into Norfolk, and really two stations, Channel 15 and Channel 27, went off the air. So there was a station sitting there. It had a 1 kilowatt transmitter, and it was fairly low powered, but it was UHF. And so I wrote Tim Bright. I said, I hear you've got this station you want to sell. How much do you want for it? And before I wrote him, I went to the high school where I had studied and played football. It's a little tiny stadium. And I walked down there, and I was praying. I said, God, if this thing is of you, how much did you want it to? How much did I spend for it? And he said, $37,000. And so when I got the letter back from Tim Bright, he said, for all of the equipment, it's going to be so much. For the studio only, but the other equipment, it's going to be so much. And the number the Lord had given me was right in the middle of what he had said. And I said, I guess that's it. So I negotiated with RCA, and, as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah, definitely. When you started, you were barely transmitting down the block. When did you decide to call this the Christian Broadcasting Network?
Well, from the very early days, I had big vision. I wanted a network. I didn't want just one station. But you're right. When we first signed on, it was on a Sunday afternoon, and our engineer didn't think we could make it. The engineer said, "There's no way you're going to put this thing on the air." I said, "We've already announced it's going on October the 1st. And so he said, "Well, I'll do what I can." I said, "Well, you get me on the air." Well, he was late, but we got on the air at about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock or so in the afternoon. The studio, we had a curtain. It had dry rot in the curtain. We didn't have any set, so we had taken two pieces of cardboard and put them together with masking tape to make a cross, and we hung that cross on this dry rot curtain. We had one camera. I think part of that had been damaged, but it was still working. And we had this tiny transmitter, and I didn't know if we were on the air. We didn't have a monitor. So down the street was a little convenience store, and we'd go in there, and I'd run down to the convenience store and turn it on to see if we were on the air. That was our monitor. But again, the Bible says, don't despise the small beginnings, and we began very, very, very small.
Well, from the small beginnings of a TV station in Virginia to a ministry that spans the globe, when we come back, Pat tells Abigail when he knew God was doing something special at CBN.
Yeah, stick around for that story and more on the special Faith Nation.
Welcome back. Revival in the Tidewater region of Virginia. For Pat Robertson, that's what marked God's movement in the ministry of the Christian Broadcasting Network.
That's right. After 7 years of being on the air, that outpouring of God sparked a new vision for CBN.
What was the turning point when you knew that the Lord was really breathing on this and that it might actually work and take off?
Well, every day, we also got a radio station along the way, by the way, that it was an old Federal transmitter, a 70-foot creosote pole, and a homemade antenna, but we got a license on channel 104.5 FM, and so we called it WXRI. That's the Greek for Christ, WXRI, and we every day had 12 noon, we had what we call a revival prayer for Tidewater. And the announcer said every day the staff of WXRI bows to pray for revival in Tidewater around the world. So we had a 15-minute prayer at noon every day praying for revival. And we did that day after day after day for about 7 years. And at the end of the 7th year, we were on the air in a telethon trying to raise some money. We asked for 700 people to give us $10 apiece a month. That was the 700 Club. So anyhow, in the middle of that time, something happened, and the power of God began to move in. And I remember one woman said, "I'm waked up in the middle of the night, and I've got to call in and make a pledge." Somebody else said, "I'm walking softly in my living room because the power of God is so strong." And there was an anointing of God that fell in an extraordinary way all over the area. People were being healed. People were being touched by the Spirit of God. And that was the beginning. It was so powerful that the following year we decided we'd go back on the air and see if we couldn't do the same thing. And lo and behold, again, the power of God came. And from that, we started a program called the 700 Club. And that, of course, has gone all over the world, that concept. But it was based on a revival where God himself moved into this area, and the place was gripped by it. As a matter of fact, I had a call from the newspaper and said, "Well, what's happening over there? Is this the second coming of Christ?" And I said, "No, this is a revival. This isn't the second coming."
Were there ever times in the 60-plus years of ministry where maybe you followed something that you thought was the Lord, but wasn't?
Oh, plenty of times, I have a motto, if you can use that, or a guiding principle. all the good stuff I give God credit for. Whatever's good, I give him credit. He did it, I didn't do it. All the screw-ups is my fault, and I'll take the blame. With that, you got no problem. But of course, I've gone into some business ventures that were just really foolish, and I did it without maybe asking God fully what I should have done. If I'd waited a little bit longer, I would have learned, or else he wanted me to make some mistakes so I'd learn from my mistakes, but I made plenty of them.
From the airwaves to the cornfields of Iowa.
When we come back, Pat explains what compelled him to run for president.
Well, back in 1987, Pat Robertson stepped off the 700 Club set and stepped right onto the campaign trail, throwing his hat in the ring as a Republican candidate for president. As
Pat tells Abigail, through the process, he learned what he calls the secret to politics.
I was with Reagan as he was running for president. There were a group of us in Dallas, Texas, that met with him when Ed Meese was his manager, and we sat around a table and we prayed together and prayed for him and talked to him, and he explained his vision. And he said, "Now, I'm going to make a speech." He said, "You can't endorse me because of the religious thing, but I can endorse you." And he said, that's what he said in the speech. I'm going to endorse you. I liked his policies. There was something about him that was so warm and engaging. When he had to leave office, I thought there was nobody that would pick up the mantle of who he was. And so I had, of course, been in politics. My father went to Congress when I was 2 years old, and I had worked along the way in political things. And I know it seemed rather crazy, but I said, God, if you want me to do this, I want to have 3 million people who would sign a petition saying they would support my candidacy. And so that was the fleece I put out.
Yeah.
It came to pass.
Yeah. And you might not have won, but how did God use that experience, and what did you learn from that?
Well, the thing that I learned was that this country has about 175,000 precincts, and the local precinct is the organizational unit for politics in America. And I learned that the secret of success in politics was to gain control of precincts. And so I trained people, hundreds of thousands of people, how to do precinct politics. Up to that time, Christians had thought politics is dirty and evil, and we as Christians shouldn't be involved. But I brought into the mix these Christian people, and they were trained, and there were hundreds of thousands of people all over the country who were now organized and trained as to how to be effective political operatives. And from that, although I didn't win, I came in third. It wasn't all that bad considering I was a rank novice. I had people like Donald Rumsfeld. I beat him. I beat Jack Kemp. I beat Al Haig, the former chief of staff. A whole lot of them, I got more votes than they did. And so the Christian people really came out to support me. But what happened was, when it was over, one of my people down in Louisiana that had worked on my campaign said, Pat, if you get out now, everything you've done is going to be lost. You've got to do something. So I was over in Europe with my wife for a few weeks of vacation, and I was sitting in an area called Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Bavaria, and we were sitting beside a little running stream in an outdoor cafe. And I began playing with some names, and out of that came something called the Christian Coalition. And I got back home, and I told some people, and I met with Lee Atwater, who'd been George Bush's campaign manager, and he said, there's nobody out there. And he said, when this happens, it's going to spread like a prairie fire. And it did. It took off like crazy. It became the most effective grassroots organization in America.
Finally tonight, with the passing of Pat Robertson, the ministry of CBN has not stopped.
In fact, he told Abby Robertson the best days are yet to come.
We're involved in CBN, and well, at least 59 different languages and as many as 200 countries. From the surveys we've had over the last few years, we've had close to 1 billion people accept the Lord, which is just astounding. And so CBN has just begun with a small group of people, a very wonderful, dedicated, consecrated, skillful people, have literally changed the world. And that's not going to stop. As far as Regent, we have about 23,000 alumni right now. They're distinguished people. They're presidents of schools. They're teaching all over the country. And the motto of the school is Christian leadership to change the world. I think we'll grow to 300,000 students. There's a big opening in India and also in China for education. And I think that we'll see a tremendous influx of students. So that's going to grow, and then everything else we're doing, the Lord's blessing is upon it. And so I just give him the credit for it.
And in addition to CBN programming and Regent University, in 1981, Pat started a legal foundation to fight for religious freedom in America. Today, it's known as the American Center for Law and Justice. He also founded a humanitarian aid outreach called Operation Blessing. For more than 40 years, OB has worked to provide disaster relief, hunger aid, medical help, and clean water around the world. Quite a legacy, quite a life of accomplishment.
And and that's just scratching the surface. There's also Orphan's Promise and so many other things that Pat did in his incredible life.
When I think about Pat, an educator, humanitarian, an innovator, I think the one word that keeps coming to mind is that he would want to just simply be known as a servant. He served the Lord, and he was humble and obedient in living a life of faithful obedience to God.
Yeah, and he gave the credit to God. Just remarkable.
Anything he did right, he credited to God.
Yeah.
Anything that he did wrong, he said, that's on me.
I love that.
Thanks for watching.
Have a great night.